I was about to turn my car key when my neighbor shouted, "Stop!" and revealed my daughter-in-law had been under the hood the night before. She thought I'd die on the highway, clearing her path to millions. But she never expected I'd show up alive and expose everything she'd been hiding. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. Charles adjusted his black tie in the rearview mirror, steadying himself for the will reading that morning. The sky above his driveway was pale and brittle, a winter sun struggling to cut through the cold. He slid the key into the ignition of his sedan, the familiar hum of the machine just one twist away, when a voice tore across the quiet street. "Stop! Don't turn that key!" His hand froze. It was Tom, his neighbor, charging across the lawn in slippers and a worn firefighter's jacket. His breath hung in the frosty air, and the urgency in his eyes was unmistakable. Charles stepped back, confusion tightening in his chest. Tom reached him, panting. "Last night, around midnight, I saw Vanessa by your car, tools in her hand, hood open, working under there for 15 minutes. His words hit like ice water. Vanessa, his daughter-in-law, the widow who would walk away with every dollar of Daniel's fortune, $35 million, if Charles didn't make it to that reading. Charles turned to the car, its polished exterior betraying nothing, no scratches, no dents. But Tom's voice carried the weight of certainty. "I've seen enough emergencies to know when something isn't right. Don't risk your life in that seat." The winter air pressed colder around them, and Charles's thoughts raced. If the brake lines were cut, if the steering was sabotaged, he'd never make it to the city. It would look like a tragic accident. Convenient. Final. He tightened his jaw, staring at the machine that had carried him faithfully for years, now possibly turned into a weapon. "They thought I'd die on the highway," he whispered to himself. "They didn't know I was about to expose every secret." Charles stood in front of his bedroom mirror, the dim morning light casting shadows across the room as he straightened the knot of his black tie. His reflection looked older than he felt, lines carved deep by time, grief, and the sudden weight of responsibility that had fallen on him after Daniel's death. The fabric of the suit felt heavier than usual, like armor preparing him for a battle he didn't want, but knew he had to fight. The will reading was set for later that morning, and the thought of it sat like a stone in his stomach. Daniel had been only 43, still strong, still full of plans. His illness had come fast, too fast, sweeping through him like fire. 3 weeks from the first complaints of stomach pain to the day. Charles stood beside his bed, helpless as the life drained from his son's eyes. No clear answers, only vague explanations from doctors Vanessa had insisted upon, specialists he had never met, appointments he had not been allowed to attend. As he adjusted his tie, Charles heard the echo of Margaret's voice in memory. His late wife had always been the compass of the family, her words plain but unshakable. "Family is built on truth, Charles. Anything less is a house made of sand." She had passed 5 years earlier, leaving him to carry that truth alone. He could almost see her now, her steady gaze urging him not to ignore what his instincts were screaming. Vanessa had been controlling during Daniel's illness, always the gatekeeper. "He needs rest," she would say, barring Charles from visiting too often. She handled the medications herself, telling the nurses what to do, never allowing his father to question. At first, Charles had chalked it up to stress, but when Daniel's health declined with frightening speed, when even a simple checkup became restricted, the unease had settled deep in his bones. Now, standing in the quiet of his house, the suspicions sharpened. Tom's warning about the car wasn't an isolated moment. It was the final piece of a puzzle that had been building for months. Vanessa's composure at the funeral, her quick conversations with lawyers, the way she avoided his eyes whenever finances came up. All of it pointed in one direction. Charles placed the tie flat against his chest and took a deep breath. Today was not just about inheritance. It was about truth. It was about whether Daniel's legacy would be honored or stolen. The house was still, but he could feel the storm waiting in the hours ahead. He picked up the envelope of documents he had prepared, notes, questions, fragments of memory that might matter later, and slipped them into his briefcase. His heart was steady now, not from peace, but from resolve. Today would not simply reveal who inherited Daniel's wealth. Today would decide whether lies won or truth finally broke through. The morning air was sharp, cold enough to sting the lungs, when Charles heard the pounding of hurried footsteps against his driveway. He had just slipped the key into the ignition when a voice rang out behind him, urgent and cutting. "Charles, stop! Don't turn that key!" He froze, his hand hovering over the ignition. Turning, he saw Tom Miller, his neighbor of 20 years, rushing toward him. The retired firefighter was still in his flannel shirt and boots, his breath rising in visible clouds. His face was pale, eyes wide with the kind of alarm a man carried only when he was absolutely certain of danger. Tom bent over the hood of the sedan, hands braced as he caught his breath. "I saw her," he said between gulps of air. "Last night, around 1:45. Vanessa was here. She had tools. She was under your hood for at least 15 minutes. Charles blinked, the words settling into his chest like ice water. "Vanessa?" he whispered. His daughter-in-law, the woman who would inherit millions if nothing stood in her way. Tom nodded sharply. "Her BMW was parked down the street, not in your driveway." She thought she was being clever. When she noticed me watching from my window, she slammed the hood and bolted. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but Charles, it wasn't casual. She knew what she was doing. Charles stepped out of the car and circled it slowly. The sedan looked untouched. No scratches, no dents, no misplaced panels. But his gut twisted with dread. He imagined brake lines, steering joints, things invisible to the eye yet fatal at 70 miles per hour. "Don't drive it," Tom warned. "Not until someone you trust checks it." Charles swallowed hard and reached for his phone. There was only one man he trusted with something this serious: Ray Donovan, an old friend and mechanic with an eye like a surgeon's. He dialed with steady hands. "Ray," he said when the line picked up, "I need you at my house. Urgent. Don't ask questions yet. Just bring your kit. My life may depend on it." And as he hung up, Charles stared back at the car, every polished curve now a silent question. What had Vanessa hidden beneath the hood? Ray arrived in less than 20 minutes, his pickup truck crunching over the frost-hardened driveway. He stepped out, carrying a steel toolbox the size of a small chest, the kind of kit only a seasoned mechanic would own. His weathered face tightened when he saw Charles's unease, and he didn't waste a second with pleasantries. "Tom filled me in," Ray said, his tone clipped but steady. "Let's get to work." Charles stepped aside, heart thudding as Ray knelt by the sedan and began his inspection. The hydraulic jack lifted the car inch by inch until its underbelly loomed above them. The garage was silent except for the clink of tools, the hiss of compressed air, and Ray's low mutters as his flashlight swept across the machine Charles had trusted for years. 5 minutes in, Ray let out a sound that made Charles's stomach drop. "Here. Look." Charles crouched beside him, the beam of light illuminating a section of tubing near the wheel well. "Brake lines," Ray explained, his voice edged with anger. The rubber was slashed cleanly, not frayed, not worn. That cut isn't from wear or accident. It's surgical, straight, deliberate, done with a sharp tool. Charles stared, bile rising. How long before they'd fail? 10, maybe 12 miles. Long enough for you to be cruising the expressway, nowhere to stop safely. You'd hit the brakes, and nothing. Ray moved farther down, tracing components with the precision of a surgeon. His flashlight caught on another tampered piece. Tie rods on the steering, loosened deliberately. You'd have lost control gradually, pulling, shaking, then complete. Collapse at highway speed. Charles's chest tightened. The plan was diabolical. Not immediate failure, but staged to look like a tragic accident. No suspicion, no trail. Just an old man, grieving, crashing on his way to his son's will reading. Ray shook his head grimly. This wasn't amateur work. Whoever did this knew cars, or had someone show them exactly what to do. Charles thought of Vanessa, her carefully painted grief, the way she had managed every detail of Daniel's illness. Of course, she wouldn't get her hands dirty unless she had to, but she had motive, and Tom had seen her under the hood. Ray began snapping photographs, his gloved hands steady as he documented each detail. These images will hold up if this goes to the police. Cuts, angles, placement, undeniable sabotage. He set each shot into a folder on his tablet, every photo a piece of proof. Charles straightened, his mind no longer clouded with grief, but sharpened into resolve. She wanted me dead before I ever reached that law office, he said quietly. Ray stood, meeting his eyes. Then you make damn sure you show up alive. Don't let her think she won. Charles nodded slowly. He would not be silenced, not by fear, not by Vanessa's schemes. He would sit across from her at the will reading, breathing, watching, and waiting for the moment her mask cracked. He glanced once more at the gleaming sedan, now exposed as a weapon disguised as transport. Then he looked to Ray, whose evidence was neatly stored and sealed. They thought I'd never make it downtown, Charles murmured, but I'll be there, and she'll see me walk through that door. The taxi smelled faintly of coffee and vinyl, its worn leather seats creaking as Charles lowered himself into the back. He gave the driver the address of the law office downtown, then settled into silence as the car pulled away from the curb. Snow flurries brushed the window, city lights blinking faintly in the distance. For the first few miles, Charles said nothing. His mind kept circling back to the discovery in his garage. If Tom hadn't shouted, if Ray hadn't confirmed the sabotage, he would already be dead, or dying somewhere along the expressway. The thought chilled him more than the winter air. But as the cab merged onto the wider road, his focus shifted. He thought of Daniel, his boy, his pride, the son who had built something extraordinary. Daniel had been a tech visionary, a cybersecurity entrepreneur who'd launched a startup from a cramped apartment and grown it into a company valued at $35 million in under a decade. He had contracts with banks, health networks, and even government agencies. He wasn't just building wealth, he was safeguarding people from invisible predators on the internet. Charles remembered visiting Daniel's office once, years ago. Servers hummed, staff typed furiously, and Daniel stood at the center like a conductor of a digital orchestra. His face lit up when he explained his newest innovation, how his software could outthink hackers. That glow of pride. Charles carried it even now, despite the bitterness of loss. Then came Vanessa. At first, she seemed like a partner who brought balance to Daniel's relentless ambition. She was polished, social, and always dressed as though she'd stepped out of a magazine. But beneath the charm, Charles had seen something else. Her eyes lingered too long on expensive cars, vacation brochures, jewelry displays. Conversations always drifted back to what money could buy, not what meaning it could bring. Charles leaned back, fingers tightening around his knee. In the final weeks of Daniel's life, those suspicions had turned darker. Vanessa controlled the schedule of visits, limiting how long Charles could stay. She insisted on managing Daniel's medication, brushing off offers of help from friends and family. And Daniel. His once strong body wasted away faster than made sense. The cab slowed at a red light, and Charles heard Daniel's voice in his memory. That final whispered warning in the hospital room. Dad, Be careful with her. At the time, Charles had dismissed it as delirium, a fragment of fear whispered through a morphine haze. But now, with the brake lines cut and the steering sabotaged, those words returned with terrifying clarity. Daniel had seen the truth long before Charles had allowed himself to admit it. The driver glanced at him through the mirror. "You all right back there, sir?" Charles cleared his throat. "Yes, just thinking." The light changed and the taxi moved forward again, carrying him toward the city skyline. But Charles no longer felt like a passenger. He felt like a man being carried into a confrontation that had been building for years. Vanessa thought she could erase him with a twist of a wrench. Instead, he was alive, armed with evidence, and ready to watch her carefully constructed facade crumble. Justice for Daniel was no longer just an idea. It was a destination, and Charles was on his way. Charles pushed open the heavy glass doors of Reynolds and Hayes law firm, the December wind following him in with a sharp bite. The marble lobby gleamed beneath chandeliers, its polished surface reflecting his dark suit and the briefcase clutched in his hand. The receptionist barely had time to greet him before all heads turned toward the sudden gasp near the velvet chairs. Vanessa. She rose too quickly, nearly stumbling in her designer heels. Her face drained of color, lips parting as though she'd seen a ghost. For a moment, she gripped the chair arm for balance, then smoothed her hair in a futile attempt at composure. Charles watched her carefully, the way her manicured fingers trembled against the fabric of her dress. You're here?" she said, voice tight. Charles tilted his head. "Alive." Much to your surprise, her throat worked as she swallowed hard. "Don't be ridiculous. Why wouldn't you be alive?" "Funny," Charles murmured, stepping closer. "Because brake lines don't cut themselves. And steering rods don't loosen by accident." Vanessa's smile flickered like a light struggling to stay on. "That's absurd. You're imagining things. You've been paranoid since Daniel passed. You can't accept that he left me in charge. You want to blame someone for your grief, and you've chosen me." Across the lobby, a few other visitors pretended to read magazines but leaned in, sensing the tension. The receptionist cleared her throat, uneasy. Charles lowered his voice, just enough that Vanessa had to lean forward. "Tom saw you, Vanessa. 11:45, tools in hand, hood open. You ran when he caught you." She froze. For one split second, the mask cracked. Then she laughed too loudly, too sharply. "That neighbor of yours? He's senile. And you're spinning wild stories because you can't stand that I was Daniel's wife. He loved me, not you." Charles studied her, calm against her desperation. "Perhaps. But Daniel also whispered to me, near the end, 'Be careful with her.' I ignored it then. I won't today." The elevator dinged. A partner stepped out to summon them. "We're ready for the will reading." Vanessa smoothed her dress again, her hand trembling just enough for Charles to notice. She lifted her chin high, walking ahead as though nothing were wrong. But her pallor betrayed her. Charles followed, steady, his voice echoing in his own mind. "They thought I'd die on the highway. Instead, I'll watch her lies collapse inside that conference room." The conference room on the 42nd floor looked like a stage built for power. Walls of glass opened onto the skyline, with Lake Michigan glimmering pale gray beneath winter clouds. A mahogany table stretched the length of the room, its surface polished to a mirror sheen. Charles entered slowly, his shoes clicking against marble, his body steady but braced, as if carrying not only his own weight, but Daniel's memory. Vanessa was already seated near the head of the table. She had chosen her spot carefully, angled toward the panoramic windows where light streamed in, bathing her in a golden glow. The black silk dress, the pearl earrings, the practiced mask of sorrow, it was all performance. Charles could see through it now. Her hands folded delicately on the table, but her eyes darted toward him with the quickness of a trapped animal. At the far end, Mr. Green, the attorney, adjusted his glasses. His suit was conservative gray, his expression unreadable. He carried a folder thick with official documents. Thank you both for arriving on time. This will reading concerns the estate of Daniel Whitaker, your late son Charles, and your husband Vanessa. Estimated value: $35 million in business holdings, real estate, and assets. Vanessa inhaled deeply, as though preparing to savor victory. Mr. Green opened the folder. Daniel's last will and testament was executed on March 3rd of this year, witnessed and notarized by 3 independent parties. We will read the provisions in full. The silence stretched taut as he began. To my wife, Vanessa Whitaker, I leave. He paused deliberately, glancing up over the rim of his glasses. Nothing. The words landed like stones dropped into water. For a moment the room was still, save for the faint hum of heating vents. Then Vanessa let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. Nothing? That's absurd. That's not what he wrote. Read it again. Mr. Green did not flinch. I leave my entire estate, including all assets, holdings, and investments, to my father, Charles Whitaker. This decision is made with full capacity of mind and is supported by my personal observations of Vanessa's conduct during my illness. Vanessa shot to her feet, her chair screeching back across the floor. Fraud! This is fraud! My husband would never cut me out. He loved me. He told me everything would be mine. Please sit down, Mrs. Whitaker, Mr. Green said calmly. The will was verified with every legal safeguard. Witnesses included Daniel's physician, his business partner, and a family friend. Each affirmed his state of mind. The document was notarized, filed, and sealed under state law. But Vanessa wasn't listening. She stormed around the table trying to snatch the folder from the attorney's hands. Charles rose instinctively, positioning himself between her and the documents. Get out of my way, she shrieked. Her eyes glittered with something unhinged now, the composure she had clung to in the lobby crumbling into raw panic. That fortune is mine. Daniel promised. He promised. Charles's voice was steady, but it cut through her frenzy like steel. Daniel promised truth would win. And it has Mr. Green closed the folder firmly. There is also an attached letter, sealed and signed in Daniel's own hand. It is to be delivered to Charles upon the reading of this. Will he reached into the folder and produced a cream-colored envelope. Daniel's familiar script scrawled across the front. Charles took it with reverence, his fingers trembling as he broke the seal. The paper inside was short, written in Daniel's steady hand. Dad, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. I know Vanessa will fight this, maybe violently, but I've seen things in her that I cannot ignore. She isolated me, controlled my treatments, and I began to suspect she wanted more than a life with me. She wanted what I built. I trust you more than anyone. Protect what I've left. Protect the family name. And above all, protect yourself. She will try to harm you too. Don't let her succeed. Charles read the words silently, then folded the letter carefully, sliding it back into its envelope. Vanessa's voice cut the air. You forged that. You're all in on this. An old man and his cronies, trying to rob me of what's mine. I'll take this to court. I'll tear it apart, line by line. Good luck, Mr. Green replied evenly. The documentation is airtight. Multiple witnesses, state certification, video testimony from Daniel affirming his decision. There is no path for you here. Vanessa's breathing grew ragged. She lunged once more toward the table, but this time security guards, summoned quietly by the receptionist outside, entered the room. They flanked her, firm but respectful, guiding her back from the documents. You can't do this to me, she cried. Her voice cracked, and her carefully maintained mask shattered fully. I gave him my life. I deserve that money. Charles's eyes burned with quiet fury. You gave him poison, neglect, and lies. Daniel saw through you, even at the end. He left his truth in writing. She sagged against the guard's arms, still muttering, still trying to protest. But her words carried no weight now, only the hollow echo of greed laid bare. Mr. Green stacked the documents neatly, aligning every page. The estate passes in full to Charles Whitaker, as stipulated by Daniel Whitaker. There is nothing further to read. Charles placed the sealed letter flat on the table, resting his hand over it. He felt Daniel's presence in every line, his son's final strength flowing through ink and paper. This wasn't just an inheritance. It was a warning, a charge, a duty. Vanessa's shrill voice still echoed as the guards escorted her out. This isn't over. I'll prove you all liars. You'll regret this. But Charles knew, as he sat in the quiet that followed, that her game was finished. Daniel's will, Daniel's letter, and the truth itself had cut through every mask she wore. And as the city skyline stretched beyond the windows, Charles whispered the words Daniel had left him. Protect yourself. Protect the truth. The fight was far from over, but the first battle had been won. The conference room was still humming from the lawyer's final words when Vanessa's composure cracked. Her polished widow's mask slid away, and what emerged was raw fury. She slammed both palms against the mahogany table, rattling the neat stacks of documents. "I deserve that money," she shouted, her voice ricocheting off the glass walls. 3 years I wasted on him, caring for his every pathetic complaint, watching him cough and choke. I earned every cent. The guests seated along the edge of the room froze. Staff near the doorway exchanged uneasy glances. The words were not those of grief, but of greed stripped bare. Charles stayed silent, his eyes fixed on her, letting her unravel before the witnesses. Vanessa's rage built like a storm. "Do you know what it's like?" she snarled, pacing the carpet. "To measure every dose so carefully, to keep track of how much arsenic." She stopped abruptly, but it was too late. The air in the room dropped to a chilling silence. Mr. Green slowly removed his glasses, his eyes narrowing. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "No one mentioned arsenic." The silence deepened. Even the city noise from beyond the windows seemed to pause. Vanessa's face drained of color, then flushed crimson as she tried to recover. "I meant medicine," she stammered. "The medications." "That's what I said." But the slip was fatal. Gasps rippled through the guests. A paralegal near the wall whispered, "She just admitted it." Another muttered, "She killed him." The careful facade she had clung to for months dissolved in a single sentence. Vanessa's eyes darted around, desperate for control. She lunged toward the folder of documents again, but 2 security guards had already stepped forward. "You won't take this from me," she shrieked, clawing at the air. "He was weak, and I made him stronger. That money is mine." The guards caught her arms as she thrashed violently, her hair tumbling loose from its perfect waves. The expensive pearls around her neck swung wildly, a cruel parody of elegance as she kicked against the polished floor. Charles did not move. He only lifted Daniel's sealed letter from the table, holding it like a shield. The room's attention shifted to him as Vanessa was dragged toward the door, her screams echoing. "This isn't over. I'll ruin you all." The glass doors shut behind her with a sharp finality. The echoes of her fury lingered for a moment, then faded into stunned silence. Guests looked at Charles with new awareness, not just as a grieving father, but as the man Daniel had trusted with his legacy. Charles finally spoke, his voice measured. "Masks fall when the truth speaks louder than lies." The staff resumed their duties slowly, the spell of chaos breaking. But no one in that room would forget the sight of Vanessa unraveling, nor the poisonous knowledge she had revealed in her blind rage. The law office had emptied after Vanessa's outburst, but Charles remained in the conference room with Mr. Green. The documents lay scattered across the polished table, silent witnesses to the chaos that had erupted. Charles reached into his briefcase and laid out a series of photographs. Each image showed the undercarriage of his sedan, the brake lines cut with surgical precision, the steering components loosened just enough to fail on the highway. "These were taken this morning," he said. "Ray, my mechanic of 20 years, documented everything. He said it wasn't natural wear. Someone designed this to kill me." Mr. Green leaned forward, studying the photographs. His expression hardened as he took in the clean, deliberate cuts. "This is no accident," he said. "If your neighbor's testimony holds up, and if Ray is willing to sign off on his findings, we have grounds for attempted murder." Charles nodded grimly. "Tom, my neighbor, saw Vanessa out there at 11:45 last night. Tools in her hand, her car parked on the street. When he confronted her, she ran Mr. Green's scribbled notes onto his legal pad. That will support our timeline. Combine it with her public outburst today, and the foundation for a criminal case grows stronger. But we'll need more. Sabotage can be proven. We need to tie it to motive." Charles slid another envelope across the table. Inside was a printout of Vanessa's credit card statements, months of unchecked luxury spending. Jewelry stores, designer boutiques, overseas vacations, all charged during the very months Daniel's health was collapsing. "She's drowning in debt," Charles said quietly. "Over $200,000, unpaid. She was desperate for money, and Daniel's death was her way out." Mr. Green's eyes narrowed as he examined the statements. Financial desperation, combined with the expectation of a multi-million-dollar inheritance. This paints the picture of motive. But I'd like to go further. We need an independent review of Daniel's medical records. If we can prove his illness was induced, her entire scheme collapses. Within days, Mr. Green had engaged a private investigator, Marcus Hale, known for uncovering financial fraud and medical manipulation. Marcus sat across from Charles at the lawyer's office, his sharp eyes scanning the files. "Your son's medical decline was unusually fast," Marcus said. "The records describe gastrointestinal distress, rapid weight loss, weakness. Doctors labeled it a rare disorder, but the test results don't add up." Charles's hands tightened around his cane. "What are you saying?" Marcus tapped a page of lab reports. "These symptoms line up more with arsenic poisoning than any natural condition. Traces in his system would build gradually, creating exactly the decline described here. Then, once his body was weakened, a slightly higher dose could have accelerated the end." The words struck Charles like a physical blow, but they also fit the puzzle that had haunted him since Daniel's death. He remembered Daniel's whispered warning from his hospital bed. "Dad, be careful with her." At the time, he'd thought it was paranoia brought on by medication. Now it sounded like prophecy. Mr. Green leaned forward, voice steady. "Can we prove it?" Marcus nodded slowly. "If we obtain tissue samples from Daniel's autopsy or medical waste, a toxicology report could confirm it. Even without it, the medical inconsistencies and Vanessa's control over his treatment raised serious suspicion." Charles spoke, his voice heavy with sorrow and resolve. "She restricted my visits. She insisted on her own doctors. She managed every pill, every test. I thought it was care. It was control." Marcus opened another folder. "And her financial trail is just as damning. I've traced dozens of high-end purchases, all made while she claimed money was tight. She bought a designer watch for $8,000 1 week after Daniel was admitted to the hospital, a trip to Paris charged while he was bedridden, hotel suites, spa treatments. She was living a double life, caretaker in public, predator in private." Mr. Green gathered the documents, arranging them into careful piles. Between the mechanic's evidence, the neighbor's testimony, the financial records, and the medical inconsistencies, We have more than suspicion. We have the beginnings of a case strong enough to bring to the district attorney. Charles felt the weight of both grief and determination pressing against him. She thought she could poison my son, sabotage my car, and walk away with his legacy. But Daniel saw her for what she was, and he trusted me to finish what he could not. Marcus placed a final sheet on the table, a timeline of Vanessa's spending, Daniel's decline, and the attempted sabotage of Charles's car. The lines converged into a chilling pattern of intent. This, Marcus said, tapping the timeline, is the story we will tell in court. A story of greed, betrayal, and deliberate destruction, and it ends with justice. For the first time since Daniel's funeral, Charles felt something stronger than grief, a sense of purpose. His son's voice echoed in memory, and his late wife Margaret's words rose with it. Family is built on truth. Now the truth was on the table, and it would not be silenced. The district attorney's office didn't take long. Within 48 hours of receiving the evidence from Mr. Green and Marcus, the machinery of justice began to move. Charles sat in the oak-paneled office of Assistant District Attorney Paula Myers, watching as she reviewed the files spread across her desk. Photographs of the severed brake lines, Tom's sworn testimony, Vanessa's spiraling financial debt, and Marcus's analysis of Daniel's medical records formed a chilling mosaic. Paula tapped her pen against the brake line photos. "This isn't negligence. This is deliberate," she said firmly. "Combined with your mechanic's testimony, we have enough to bring attempted murder charges on the car sabotage alone. And if the toxicology results confirm Marcus's suspicion of arsenic poisoning, she could face additional charges for your son's death." Charles nodded, his expression calm but heavy with resolve. "She tried to kill me, the same way she killed Daniel. She thought she could bury both of us under silence." Paula slid the stack of documents into a secure evidence folder. "We'll seek an arrest warrant this afternoon." Given her financial motive and the evidence of premeditation, the judge won't hesitate. She won't see this coming. The next morning, Charles received the call. The warrant had been signed. By dusk, officers would execute it. He stood by his living room window, cane in hand, as unmarked police vehicles rolled down the street toward Vanessa's luxury home. The late sun slanted across, manicured lawns catching the gleam of holiday decorations still hanging from eaves. Neighbors raked leaves and children played on driveways, unaware that they were about to witness a scene they would never forget. 2 black SUVs pulled up to Vanessa's circular driveway. Officers in plain clothes stepped out, followed by a uniformed sergeant carrying a clipboard. They approached the front door with professional calm, but the tension in their movements betrayed the seriousness of the moment. Charles parked across the street, out of sight, but close enough to hear when the sergeant knocked sharply on the heavy oak door. "Chicago Police Department, Mrs. Vanessa Jordan, we have a warrant for your arrest. Please open the door." There was a pause, long enough for curtains to twitch in neighboring houses. Then the door opened, and Vanessa appeared, wrapped in a silk robe, her hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. At first, confusion flickered across her face. Then recognition dawned as she saw the warrant in the sergeant's hand. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp with indignation. "You can't just come here like this." The sergeant's tone remained steady. "Mrs. Jordan, you are under arrest for attempted murder and under suspicion of poisoning in the death of your late husband, Daniel Jordan. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Gasps rose from neighbors who had gathered at the edges of their lawns. Mothers pulled children closer. Whispers rippled down the street. Vanessa's expression shifted rapidly. Shock, disbelief, then fury. She raised her voice, pitching it toward the watching crowd. "This is harassment, lies made up by a bitter old man trying to ruin me." The sergeant gestured to his officers. "Ma'am, step outside." 2 officers moved in, guiding her firmly but without unnecessary force. Vanessa struggled, pulling her arm back, but the cuffs clicked into place with finality. Her silk robe fluttered as she twisted, her composure unraveling before the very people she had worked so hard to impress. Across the street, Charles remained still, his eyes fixed on the scene. The woman who had smiled through Daniel's funeral, who had restricted his visits, who had plotted his death and his own, now stood exposed under the fading light. One of the neighbors, Mr. Alvarez, whispered loudly to his wife, "I always knew something was off about her." Others nodded, murmuring agreement. The facade of respectability Vanessa had cultivated for years crumbled in the span of minutes. As officers led her toward the waiting SUV, she spotted Charles across the street. Her eyes locked onto him, burning with rage. She leaned against the restraint of the officers, her voice cutting through the evening air. "You think you've won, old man. This isn't over." The words carried across lawns, chilling in their venom. But Charles didn't flinch. He leaned heavier on his cane, straightening his back with quiet strength. For years, Vanessa had thrived on control, on appearances. Now she was being taken away, her designer heels scraping the driveway like broken glass. The officers placed her in the back of the SUV, the door closing with a heavy thud. Neighbors stood silently as the convoy pulled away, leaving behind whispers and shaken heads. Children clutched their parents' hands, sensing that something irreversible had just happened on their quiet street. Charles turned from the window of his parked car, his reflection caught in the glass. He thought of Daniel, his brilliant, ambitious son, cut down not by fate, but by betrayal, from within his own home. He thought of Margaret, whose voice echoed still. Family is built on truth. Tonight, truth had arrived with flashing lights and arrest warrants. The neighborhood slowly settled as police cars disappeared. But the weight of Vanessa's last words lingered, a threat hanging in the air. Charles knew trials were long, messy battles. Yet he also knew something she had never understood. Justice is not a single moment. It is persistence, built day by day, fact by fact, until the lies collapse under their own weight. For now, the first battle was over. Vanessa was in custody. The evidence was strong, and Charles, once marked for silence, was very much alive, ready to see the war through. The courtroom felt colder than usual the day Vanessa stood trial. Reporters crowded the benches, their pens and cameras poised to capture the downfall of the woman once admired for her charm and elegance. The gallery buzzed with anticipation as the prosecution laid out the case. Deliberate car sabotage, attempted murder of Charles, and poisoning that matched Daniel's mysterious death. Exhibits were displayed, photographs of cleanly cut brake lines, receipts showing Vanessa's mounting debt, and medical analysis pointing to toxins in Daniel's system. Vanessa sat at the defense table, her designer suit a poor substitute for the composure she once wielded. She glared across the room at Charles, who remained steady, his cane resting at his side. He thought of Daniel, of Margaret, of every warning sign that had been brushed away until it was too late. Today, truth finally had its voice. Witness after witness stepped forward. Tom explained the precision of the sabotage. Marcus outlined the trail of financial desperation. Dr. Patel described symptoms consistent with poisoning. Even neighbor Tom, with quiet firmness, testified that he saw Vanessa under the hood of Charles's car late that night. The defense tried to cast doubt, but each piece of evidence fit together too perfectly, like gears in a clock winding toward justice. When the jury returned after 2 days of deliberation, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty on all counts. The words rang through the chamber, erasing Vanessa's last hope. Her shoulders slumped as the judge fixed her with an unwavering gaze. Vanessa Jordan, you are sentenced to 25 years in state prison without possibility of parole for attempted murder, and an additional 10 years years for fraudulent inheritance claims, to run concurrently. The gavel's strike echoed like thunder. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Headlines flashed across screens. Wealthy widow turned criminal. Inheritance plot exposed. Justice for tech entrepreneur. Neighbors who once admired Vanessa now whispered her name with disgust. She had become a symbol, not of grace, but of greed. Charles stood at the courthouse steps, microphones thrust toward him. His voice carried the weight of both grief and relief. My son can finally rest in peace. His brilliance, his kindness, will not be overshadowed by betrayal. Today, truth has prevailed. Justice has been served. The cameras clicked, but Charles didn't care for the spectacle. He cared only that Daniel's memory was safe, preserved by truth, and shielded from the poison of Vanessa's lies. The weeks after the trial were filled with a quiet kind of purpose. Charles had spent so long battling suspicion, betrayal, and grief that when the courtroom doors finally closed on Vanessa, he felt a new weight settle onto his shoulders, the responsibility of legacy. Daniel's brilliance in cybersecurity had not only built wealth, but had created innovations that protected hospitals, banks, and even government systems. That work could not end with him. Sitting at his old oak desk, the same one where Margaret used to organize family Christmas cards, Charles began drafting the mission statement for what would become the Daniel Foundation for Cybersecurity Education. The words came slowly at first, but then flowed with clarity. Scholarships for young engineers, funding for research into digital protection, grants for underfunded schools to teach coding and ethics. This was how his son's work would outlive betrayal. The inheritance, $35 million that Vanessa had tried to twist into her escape, was now redirected toward shaping futures. Charles met with lawyers, educators, and Daniel's former colleagues. Each conversation reinforced his decision. They shared stories of Daniel's generosity, of how he mentored interns late at night, of how he always believed knowledge should be shared, not hoarded. Months later, at the Foundation's launch, banners with Daniel's name hung across the hall of a Chicago university. Students filled the rows, their faces bright with possibility. Charles stepped up to the podium, his voice steady. "Greed tried to silence my son's legacy," he said. "Love made sure it speaks louder than ever." Applause thundered, and Charles knew Margaret would have been proud. Back home, he placed a new photo on the mantel. Daniel, with a group of young coders he once mentored. It joined the family portraits, not as a reminder of loss, but as a symbol of hope reborn. Charles sat at his desk, the afternoon light slanting through the curtains, casting long shadows across the papers of the newly established foundation. For the first time in months, the house felt still. Not with the suffocating weight of grief, but with a calm that spoke of resolution. He leaned back, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of Daniel's photo, and let his thoughts settle on the journey that had brought him here. "Silence would have cost me my life," he thought, his voice steady even in solitude. "Truth saved me." That single truth, that Vanessa's greed had driven her to poison Daniel and attempt to kill him as well, had shattered illusions, but also lit the path toward justice. If he had turned the key in that car without question, the story would have ended in twisted metal on a highway, and Vanessa would have walked away with everything. Instead, Charles had chosen to see, to listen, to act. He understood now that silence was not peace. Silence, in the face of lies, only allowed destruction to grow. His son's whispered warning, Margaret's remembered words, his neighbor's vigilance, all of it had converged to remind him that truth, however painful, was the only thing that protected family. As he looked around the quiet room, his heart no longer felt crushed by loss. It was filled with purpose. Daniel's foundation was already alive, offering scholarships and opportunities that would ripple across generations. That was real inheritance. Not numbers in a bank account, not marble houses or luxury cars, but protection, knowledge, and hope. Family isn't about inheritance, Charles whispered into the stillness. It's about protecting what matters, even after death. The words settled over him like a vow. Betrayal had taken so much, but love had answered louder. And that, he knew, would echo longer than any silence. If your daughter-in-law tried to kill you for $35 million, would you stay silent? Or would you fight back with everything you had? That is the question at the heart of today's story. Charles chose to confront the danger head-on, and because of that choice, justice was served and his son's legacy was protected. Now I want to hear from you. If you were in his shoes, facing betrayal from inside your own family, what would you do? Would you keep the peace, or would you risk everything to uncover the truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story struck a chord with you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more powerful stories of betrayal, justice, and redemption. And make sure you turn on notifications so you never miss the moment when silence turns into action. And stay tuned for our next episode, because it's one you won't want to miss. The day I came home and found a stranger living in my house, with papers claiming it was theirs.